Hear oral evidence from Stonewall, the Lesbian and Gay Foundation, and the Gender Identity Research and Education Society. For the record, please would you introduce yourselves to the committee, and I'll give you an opportunity to do that. Before calling the first member to ask a question, I should like to remind all members that questions should be limited to matters within the scope of the bill, and that we must stick strictly to the timing of the programme motion the committee has agreed, and I hope I don't have to interrupt. So, if required, can I invite you, Paula, to just introduce yourselves, and then we'll go into the questions.
Good afternoon. I'm Paula Dooley. I'm a trustee with the Gender Identity Research and Education Society.
Thank you.
I'm Terry Reid, also a trustee of Gender Identity Research and Education Society. We call it JARS for short.
I'm Sian Payne. I'm a director at the Lesbian and Gay Foundation.
I'm Ben Summerskill from Stonewall.
Thank you. You're welcome. Kate Green.
It's been said that the civil partnership legislation has already conferred pretty well all the same rights and status on same-sex couples as this legislation would do by enabling same-sex couples to enter into marriage. Can you say how important you think the opportunity to marry is to same-sex couples and what difference it's going to make?
I'm happy to start with that one. I have two friends, Claire and Carly, and they on the 29th of January celebrated 12 years together, and a week later, on the 5th of February, an hour after the House passed the bill, Claire proposed to Carly, which it was a fantastic moment for both of them, and the reason it took place on that day at that time was because they'd for the first time seen the opportunity of having equality. That's what it means.
I mean, can I perhaps just respond to that briefly in three ways? I think first, we are alive to the fact that there are now an increasing number of lesbian and gay people, particularly younger ones, who want their family structures to be described in exactly the same way as everyone else's, and for those who have children, that is particularly important. The second thing I think we would say is that there were many people who rather hoped at the time of the introduction of civil partnership, and many of you were involved in that, and we remain very grateful, but there were many people who hoped that that would lead to lesbian and gay and bisexual people being treated in the public space in exactly the same way as others. And in fact, and we always try and rely on hard evidence. I mean, there is current polling that shows that 800,000 people in the British workforce have witnessed physical homophobic bullying at work in the last 5 years. 98% of secondary school pupils who identify as gay regularly hear homophobic language. There are 20,000 homophobic crimes still being committed in this country every year, and I think we have come to the view that until people are treated in exactly the same way legislatively, there is a risk that those distinctions will continue to be made. And I think I would just say finally, I mean, some of the language we have heard in the public space in recent weeks and months, comparing gay people in long-term relationships to abortionists, to bestialists, to paedophiles, actually has rather galvanised the view of a lot of gay people that it is time that this distinction is eroded.
Can I just add, in regard to trans people, and of course that's what we're really here this afternoon to talk specifically about, having this distinction has been devastating to the lives of many married trans people, and we would like to give more information about that later. But just right now, I would also like to say, as a cisgender heterosexual person who's been in a marriage for 52 years to the same man, I absolutely welcome, as most heterosexual people do, I believe, equality in this field. If we do not use language which is equal, people will continue to think that there is some kind of a hierarchy here. There shouldn't be. If we want an equal society, we use equal language.
Thank you.
Mr. Doughty.
Thank you, Chair. Strikes me from both the evidence you presented, but also my reading of this bill, is that it's very much a permissive and protecting bill. And I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on your thoughts about that in terms of the overall scope of the bill.
Well, I have to say we're very pleased that the government has moved slightly from its original position and has agreed to, ministers have agreed to do what we requested, which is make permissive and not mandatory provision for the celebration of same-sex marriages by those denominations that wish to celebrate them. One of the benefits of that proposal is, in practical terms, it almost exactly mirrors the provisions in the Equality Act we secured in 2010 to permit the celebration of civil partnership in religious premises, and means it's possible to be clear that there are no particular impediments to doing that. The other reason we're delighted the government has put forward the bill pretty much in the form it has is that it's often forgotten that there are some, and some of them happily are here today, there are some lesbian and gay people of profound religious faith who wish to celebrate their marriages with denominations that of themselves have decided collectively through prayer and through consulting their God that they wish to do this. You'll hear from some of those people, and it does seem an important issue of religious freedom that any denomination that wishes to celebrate such a marriage should not be prevented from doing so, either by Parliament or indeed by more powerful religious denominations who disagree with them.
Stephen Gilbert.
Can I ask you to elaborate, please, on the effect you think this will have on those lesbian and gay couples who are bringing up children at the moment, and also on the instances of homophobic bullying that Ben, you were alluding to. I think one of the issues we're struggling with in the committee is getting the balance between equality and protecting families, but one of the things that's often missed out in the debate is that there are an awful lot of lesbian and gay families with children who are affected by the situation as it currently is.
Oh, so no, I'm being polite, but no, it's never done me any good in the past. It is absolutely true that it's not just children who may be growing up to be lesbian and gay, or who identify as growing up to be lesbian and gay, who are the victim of who are full victim to homophobic bullying. There are, of course, whole cohorts of children, girls who are good at games, boys who do their homework, who fall victim to that. But one of the groups of children who do too are those who have lesbian and gay parents, and that's why the way in which we've historically measured the incidence of homophobic bullying in schools doesn't just apply to, as I said, those children who aren't growing up gay themselves, but half of secondary school pupils who have identified as gay have been physically bullied in the last 3 years, and perhaps more worrying, of all the young people who witness homophobic bullying at school, half of them say that their schools or their teachers do nothing about it. And there is very little doubt in our mind now that until those teachers and schools are reassured that all young people should be treated in exactly the same way, with the same respect for their future family structures, we are anxious that level of bullying will not be reduced.
Ben Bradshaw.
Can I ask Paula and Terry first? Are you satisfied that the bill as it stands addresses the injustices that are currently suffered by trans couples? And if not, how would you like to see it changed?
We're absolutely delighted that government has taken a major and brave step forward to beginning to address the trans marriage issue. I myself have been married now, 39 years, and I was actually awarded an interim gender recognition certificate, but I just could not use it to end my marriage. There are some difficulties that we do have with the bill. The first one is actually on pensions. There's a difficulty with those that are in an occupational pension scheme, where the survivor's pension is considered. What happens under the bill as currently configured is that should a person get a GRC within a marriage, then their spouse's survivor pension will be dramatically, in some cases, reduced. Now, we believe this is fundamentally unfair, because what we seem to be seeing is the arrangements for gay and lesbian folk, we're being shoehorned into those. Now, don't forget, this particular couple, this mythical couple, they're already married. They've already paid the entitlement for proper benefits on the GRC person's death. So it doesn't remove the difficult choice that the person will have, again, between choosing gender recognition for themselves and their spouse. So how could anybody expect a person, well, I certainly couldn't inflict it on my spouse if it affected me, I could not condemn her to a reduced pension just to get my gender recognition certificate. So that's wrong. Now, there's also issues associated, related to pensions, with people that did annul to get their GRCs and then formed a civil partnership. There's a structural imbalance within the bill between the needs of the spouse and the trans person applying for a gender recognition certificate. Now, I think the intention of the bill is to make sure that the non-trans spouse is not actually bounced into a marriage, which is a legal same-sex marriage. Before the weekend, I asked my spouse, who's in that position, one whose rights apparently are going to be protected by the bill, I said to her, what is the difference between the same-sex legal marriage we are now in, and let me explain that, we're both the same physical sex, and we're still legally married, and if I was awarded a GRC under this bill, if it became an act, the legal same-sex marriage we would then be in. So legal same-sex marriage, same legal sex marriage. What is the difference? And she spent the whole weekend thinking about this. And she said, there is no difference. But the important point is that because you're saying there is a difference, a number of complications arise. Now, one of the issues that is not dealt with at all is the so-called difficult hostile spouse issue. There are a number of spouses who get extremely angry when, and quite rightly so, when their partner decides they're going to transition. They can actually withdraw completely from the annulment process, not sign forms, refuse to cooperate. They may not even be obtainable. The trans person may not even know where they are. So the effect of this is an effective spousal veto on the applicant obtaining gender recognition, and we don't think this is fair, and we don't actually think that should be allowed to stand. What we are saying would be fairer, and it has a number of advantages that would actually simplify the bill, is to actually award the gender recognition certificate on the basis of the application alone and not in the context of the relationship. At the present time, an interim gender recognition certificate will be awarded if there is no spousal consent for the marriage to continue. Now, if that happened, the annulment could go ahead using the gender recognition certificate. And we don't see any difference in principle, but there are a number of benefits that arise from that. And that is, first of all, the problem with the spouse who was angry would not be there. There'll be less pressure on people to to come to a decision within the 6 months. And believe you me, 6 months is not enough time to actually work out what to do with your relationship. So there'd be less pressures on families. The bill would be simplified. The application process through the gender recognition panel would be a lot easier. But families are more likely to stay together, and that's what it's all about, really. It takes the pressure off people. So if you can see a difference between a legal same-sex marriage and a same legal-sex marriage, and that's significant and quantifiable, then obviously the interim gender recognition certificate route should stand, but we can't. Now, there's a couple of other points. The first one is the fact that those that actually did give up their marriages to get a gender recognition certificate and then formed a civil partnership, these people were mortified at the time. They feel really hurt that they had to actually go through that process. They still feel hurt. Their marriages were actually annulled, and so in effect they never really happened, but they were real marriages to these people. They had to give up their marriage certificates. So can these relationships be reinstated? Can they have a marriage certificate which goes back and shows the original date of their marriage? Please consider these people. The last point that I will mention is that many were surprised that the fast track issue was not raised in the bill. Let me briefly explain. The 2004 Gender Recognition Act introduced the excellent principle of fast track. This was for people that had transitioned long term to actually go through a more simplified process to get gender recognition. We feel that there's a number of trans people who have remained in marriages and are long-term transition that would benefit from a similar process. So if it was right in principle in 2004, surely it's right in principle now.
Tim Lawton.
I think that some really technical permutations to what you just raised there show some of the unintended consequences or things that will need to be considered if this legislation goes through. But can I come back to perhaps some of the things that Ben was saying? Because those of us, I think all of us here, quite rightly, support the civil registration legislation in 2004, and it was late in coming, and it was good and groundbreaking legislation. Perhaps one or two of the witnesses this morning didn't share that view.
I've rather lost count of people in the last few weeks who said they fully supported it. I know you were one of them who said they fully supported it, and that wasn't quite my recollection, but I fully appreciate you.
Well, I voted for it at the time, Absolutely. So that should be a recollection. But what I want to get my head round is when we voted for it in 2004 but didn't vote for marriage, we weren't accused of being bigots and homophobes then. And that piece of legislation was supposed to be, and was seen as, and I've read through the debates again, as an end in itself. So what actually has changed, and I think you started to allude to some of the attitudes that may have changed between 2004 and 2013 to make this piece of legislation now so necessary. And you, Ben, again referred to the serious problems about homophobic bullying and others, which are absolutely there and which absolutely need to be addressed. But as I said in my speech the other day, these are social issues and social attitudes that we need to be addressed. And why will they be addressed so effectively simply by, as a consequence of this legislation, where in fact I think it's a bigger task we've got to do to try and change people's mindsets. And what I'm yet to be convinced of is why this piece of legislation will help in doing that.
Well, I think we are clear that in some sense we had shared your vision in 2003, 2004, 2005. We thought that this and the law often does lead the way in terms of hearts and minds, and I think all of you on all sorts of issues will have appreciated that. But we are seeing hard evidence that that has not happened, and you referred to people being referred to bigots as bigots. I mean, certainly that's an expression we would only ever use for someone who compares gay people, as I said, to bestialists or polygamists, and in that case it seems quite a temperate description. But in fact, we are clear that until everyone sees gay people as being equal at law, that we're unlikely to see those changes in public attitudes. And those are areas, actually, since 2005, in areas around education, around the workplace, where Stonewall is now doing quite a lot of very specific and, if I might say, quite effective work that's accompanied by hard evidence research into the attitudes people actually hold. But certainly, and there are other issues that have arisen over the years, many of you who have dealt with me and with Stonewall over the years will know that assiduously we have never asked for legislative steps that we did not believe were going to right a specific mischief. We've always sought legislative steps, for example, on the offence of incitement to homophobic hatred, where we believed that there was a genuine and evidence need for that legislative change to be made.
I'm conscious there's a lot of questions and maybe another point or two from some of our witnesses. Paula, did you indicated you wanted to make a small point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just more fully answering the question, there is one thing that I really must mention, and that is the terminology used in the bill has two implications. The first one is husband and wife are the terms used, and those terms are not necessarily suitable for a trans-affected marriage. For instance, my spouse would never consider me, if we got a revised marriage certificate, as her wife. She would never ever consider that. So the terminology is not suitable. But more importantly, the bill doesn't seem to have considered the people that fit outside the gender binary. These people are always ignored, it seems. And so we have an equal marriage bill which is equal marriage for most but not all. So what I'm saying is that you really have to consider, if you want equal marriage for all, the requirements of the non-binary people who would object completely to the terms husband and wife. It's a simple adjustment, I think.
And that would include people with intersex conditions who are feeling very excluded by this whole process. I think they have put in written submissions but have not been invited to give live evidence. And I think they do represent something like 1% of the population, so it's really important that they are able to be included. The exclusivity of the terms does, as Paula said, make sure that a lot of people are not going to be happy either with the celebration of their relationships or possibly the certificates that go alongside that.
Jane Ellison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose just turning to one of the many sort of the biggest areas of concerns expressed to many of us in our inboxes around, I suppose, the quadruple lock, the likelihood of legal challenge, all of those things. I just wondered what view you'd formed as organisations around that and whether you think it gets the right balance of rights. And I think specifically Stonewall made a commitment about not supporting people who wanted to come forward and challenge that should the bill become an act. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, I mean, there may not be much economic stimulus out there unless you're a locksmith, of course, at the moment. And we have been assisted. I mean, you heard this morning from Lord Pannick and Lady Kennedy with a very, very clear opinion from them and other leading counsel that the lock is sufficient to do what the Church of England has said. I was pleased the Church of England were able to say this morning that it does exactly what they wanted to have done, even if it may seem slightly excessive. And we have, as you say, been crystal clear that we would not support, under any circumstances, a legal case involving a celebrant who chose not, in a religious premises, who chose not to actually take part in a same-sex marriage. And I wrote as long ago as the 19th of March last year to David Davis, the Monmouth MP, saying, I can happily reassure you there are no circumstances whatsoever in which Stonewall would support a case by a gay couple wishing to marry in a church which did not recognise gay marriage. He did incidentally say that were he to receive such an undertaking, he would support the bill, a promise he did not keep.
Jonathan Reynolds.
Thank you, Chair. Paul very helpfully raised some specific issues around pension provision, and there are some wider ones that the Equality and Human Rights Commission raised in their evidence around pension provision for same-sex married couples, civil partners and widows' benefits. We asked the Secretary of State this morning, who gave us a figure of roughly what it would have cost to address those. Can I ask you, are you content to see those addressed at a later date, or are you disappointed that they're not addressed in this bill before us?
Sure. Well, I think that what we're really saying is that you've defined the concept of a protected marriage for trans people, and we believe that marriage should be protected. If the entitlements have already been paid for, then surely this is a cost for trans people. It's a cost-neutral issue. It comes down to trying to impose the relationships intended for gay and lesbian folk who now wish to get married onto trans folk who are already married. So we don't believe there is a cost issue here at all. We believe it might be an administrative convenience issue.
Helen Grant.
Could I ask Paul and Terry what Clause 12, Schedule 5 will actually mean for trans people? And that is notwithstanding the important points that have been made about certificates and hostile spouses and pensions. But are the community, do trans people generally feel happy with this clause and the procedure and the effect of it?
Right. So I'm afraid I'm not really sure what Clause 12... Clause 12?
It's Clause 12, change of gender of married persons. It's the clause.
It's in the main bill?
It is.
Yeah, I've got that in front of me.
It's what we've been talking about.
Yes, I've only got the schedule here in front of me, I'm sorry. We're generally happy with it, absolutely, but what we're saying is that it could be so much better and so much simpler. And we think it's unnecessarily complicated and doesn't relieve the pressure on trans people and their families as much as it could be.
Chris Bright.
Do you think... This morning we had the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, the Equalities Minister, Maria Miller, and she was referring to marriage as the gold standard, which seemed to sort of imply that it's a bit of a shame that we bothered inventing civil partnerships in the first place. So would you want to get rid of civil partnerships, keep civil partnerships until they kind of wither on the vine, or allow civil partnerships for heterosexual couples?
I think it would be nice to have a fully equal system. So, I think the ideal would be if we had one for one and we had it for all. One of the issues for same-sex couples is that obviously they've had civil partnerships but not had access to marriage, and now you're creating the access to marriage without access to civil partnerships. However, it's probably more of a position for those individuals who might want to enter into an opposite-sex civil partnership to discuss that from an opposite-sex relationship point of view. In terms of same-sex couples, I think it will sort of play out as it will. I'm not sure what the plans are for civil partnerships. As far as I'm aware, they're just going to remain in place. I think it would be a shame to continue the inequality, but yet some people want that inequality to remain. I would assume there would come a time in the future when civil partnerships don't exist anymore, they become obsolete, and there is marriage. But because a separate system has been created, there will be that desire from people to retain that option. So I think it's actually going to be a difficult one to see out.
I think we would say on that, perhaps the gold standard is something from a simpler time, when things were not as complex as they are nowadays, both socially and economically. And our view in relation to opposite-sex civil partnerships is that we are agnostic about them, simply because supporting equality and the well-being of heterosexuals is not one of Stonewall's charitable objectives, and our perception is that, on the whole, what with one thing and another over the centuries, heterosexuals seem to have done all right sticking up for themselves. They don't need us to tell them what's good for them. And, you know, it may well be that in 30 years' time, either, as you've indicated, civil partnerships may just wither on the vine, or indeed there may be a huge upswell of heterosexual people who want them, but I'm not sure there's huge evidence of that at the moment, and it does seem the government seems to be addressing perceived mischiefs that exist today, rather than speculating about what might arise in the future.
But there's this myth that there is such a thing as common law marriage, which doesn't exist at all, and actually an awful lot of people, heterosexual couples, end up in a quite potentially abusive situation where they have no legal rights at all. The partner dies or walks out or whatever, and then the one partner is...
Well, that's absolutely true, and the Law Commission's considered that very carefully, but as I said, it's not our locus to comment on that, and we're very strict about actually adhering to campaigning on exactly what we are funded to campaign on.
Paula.
As a heterosexual person, and many in my position are, we feel that it's wrong in principle to bounce somebody out of a civil partnership to obtain gender recognition. The issue is no different in principle to that the 2004 GRA required to us to actually end our marriages. So we don't believe that people already in a civil partnership should be bumped out of that relationship unless they choose to. So as a heterosexual, I strongly support having civil partnerships open to all.
Steve Williams.
Thank you. Mr. Bright has asked what I was broadly going to ask, but can I put it perhaps in another way to Ben and Sean? Can you imagine any gay couple in a civil partnership objecting to civil partnerships being opened up to opposite-sex couples? Is there any conceivable reason why they would?
I think it's quite a difficult question to speak for individual partnerships within that do have civil partnerships. I would assume that anything's possible. That very much so people might argue that something that is created for same-sex couples should not be opened up to opposite-sex couples in exactly the same way that opposite-sex couples have argued that something created for them should not be opened up to same-sex couples.
Well, what I'm trying to get to, Mr. Hood, is I'm trying to sort of trace where the objection might come from for having complete parity of steam all round, that opposite-sex and same-sex couples can both have a civil marriage, but also that opposite-sex couples and same-sex couples can have a civil partnership. It's hard to find out who actually objects to civil partnerships being opened up. So it's neither of your organisations?
It's not something that...
Very clearly, it's just something we would not express a view. Just as, in fairness, we would not express a view on the gender pay gap, although I'm sure you can imagine what our view of the gender pay gap is.
Heterosexuals should have the same right as non-heterosexuals. Quite honestly, they should be opened up.
Ben?
I don't think Ben and Sean quite answered Jonathan's question about whether this bill delivers equality on pensions. Perhaps you could do that. But my question was about the change in the rules on consummation from the consultation to the bill, and I wondered what you thought about that.
In terms of pension, I think it's a disappointment. One of the positions around creating marriage equality was that it was equality, and I think it's a shame. From our point of view, it's a shame that inequality continues. However, from a purely pragmatic point of view, we can understand why that is as it is, and we would prefer to have the concept of marriage equality rather than fight for something that is at this stage not really feasible. So from the pensions point of view, a disappointment, but an understandable one.
I say that's not quite our perception, and people will remember we had quite a big fight with the then Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time of the introduction of civil partnership, because he didn't want us to have public sector partner pensions at all. It cuts in two ways. In terms of the public sector, our understanding and our clear understanding, having dealt with this for a number of years over civil partnership, is that in fact the discrimination between backdating of partner pensions to between 1978 and 1988 is in fact a gender discrimination and not a sexual orientation discrimination, and therefore it was never going to be put right by a bill of this sort. In the private sector, we acknowledge, although ministers will be able to offer observations on this too, we acknowledge that the government has never legislated retrospectively for private sector pension schemes. However, I can say that in every case that we have been involved in at Stonewall, that we've taken on of someone who had a private sector entitlement prior to 2005, we've been successful in persuading their business, their company or their trustees to change the terms of their pension scheme. So we don't see a huge mischief that would ever have been put right by this, but except, of course, in relation to trans and the technical issues around pensions for trans people, that's something that JARAs will offer advice on.
And consummation?
Well, consummation, I have to say, and I think that this is a parallel argument to adultery, although, of course, consummation is grounds for annulment and adultery is grounds for divorce, something that Mr. Charles Moore and the Daily Telegraph don't seem to have quite grasped. But the reality with adultery is exactly these arguments arose at the time of the introduction of the Civil Partnership Bill. You know, how would you manage without adultery as grounds for dissolution? Happily, the proportion of civil partnerships that's been dissolved is very small. It's about 3% in relation to heterosexual marriage, which seems to be a little bit more flimsy. But the absence of availability of adultery as grounds for dissolution simply hasn't arisen as a problem in the last 7 years. And in terms of consummation, you know, I mean, one does almost feel one's getting to angels and pinheads in this territory. We simply haven't seen, you know, we see an appetite both for civil partnership and for marriage and the long-term commitment with all the mutual care and understanding that involves, but we haven't seen a lot of our stakeholders saying they are deeply, deeply concerned about consummation. And it may be that, you know, perhaps sex is something that heterosexual people are slightly more fixated about than homosexual people. if that's
David Burrows.
Oh. Yes.
Not necessarily sex, but sexual fidelity has been an issue which has fixated people in terms of supporting marriage. And on that point, would you not, if you were to define adultery, same-sex adultery, how would you do it?
Well, I wouldn't do it. I think it's. I mean, you know, it's.
But there is an argument out there. I mean,
it would be perfectly possible. I think the government used a slightly, with great respect to ministers, weasel-worded form of words of it will be left to case law. But then the development of adultery, of heterosexual adultery, has been a matter of case law over hundreds of years anyway. And as I said, there is, you know, this is just me being kind of pragmatic in a public policy sense. If there is no great need to develop the detail of a piece of legislation, it seems slightly pointless to get bogged down in what that detail might be. And there has, of course, always been an anomaly, effectively, in relation to adultery, because if a woman who has been in a heterosexual marriage has had an affair with another woman, then she's not had access. The husband, were he to use that as grounds for dissolution, has not had access to a claim of adultery. He has had to resort to unreasonable behaviour, and certainly all my knowledge, and this is one area where I can only say this is intuitive, because I prefer to rely on the hard evidence of what our stakeholders think, but all my knowledge is that where you have had people who are committed to each other in very long-term stable relationships, the problem of adultery has not been one, with which they are particularly obsessed.
So we're in relatively new territory. You can say you talk about your stakeholders, but your same stakeholders weren't necessarily demanding same-sex marriage 2 years ago.
Well, I think when the session opened, we gave quite a lengthy explanation, but you weren't in your seat at the time, so I regret you didn't hear that.
Chris Bryant?
I'm slightly troubled by this bit about common law definitions, because if you just leave things to the common law, it could be years and years before people had any kind of security or certainty, legal certainty about what they'd be entering into. I mean, bizarrely, the common law definition of a brothel includes a place to which is frequented by men to perform lewd homosexual practices, including dancing, and says, which includes a lot of places that several members might have been, but has nothing to do with sex.
This is another world to me.
You're coming across more episcopal than the bishop, certainly. But isn't the truth of the matter that actually very few people use adultery now? It will be unreasonable behaviour, regardless of the kind of theological concept of adultery.
Exactly. The number of cases and I know the Secretary of State was asked about this morning, the number of cases we understand, although they're not measured, in heterosexual divorce is where adultery is cited as opposed to unreasonable behaviour, even if in fact it is adultery that has caused that relationship to break down. The number of cases is currently infinitesimal, and that's why we just don't see a practical benefit in getting bogged down into trying to define something and to create legislation where legislation, if one's being brutal about it, is not needed.
Mr. Doughty, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just taking back to it, we've had a lot of people raising concerns both in the second reading debate and in committee about the polling out there. What do the public think of this bill and the proposals around it? And obviously people can quote any number of figures from their own postbags or polls left, right, and centre. But what's your understanding of the polling evidence that's out there, and particularly the kind of the age divide that there does seem to be in some of the polls, certainly that I've read, certainly in terms of the younger generation coming through, very overwhelming support for this measure in terms of the next people who are going to be going forward and wanting to enter into marriage, whether they're same-sex or heterosex or trans or anything else.
Do you have polling evidence?
I think it's in terms of what's out there. You're right. From 2004, figures are starting at around 55% for people who are in support of same-sex marriage, not civil partnership, same-sex marriage. And that is going through to the most recent ones in 2012 that I'm aware of, where you're right, that age divide is, I think it was 78% for people aged between 16 and 24, going down to 37% for those, I think it was 65 plus, was it? And that is quite a big difference in terms of the age gap. I think in some ways it's incredibly heartening to see that we've got a younger generation who is coming through who see equality and see same-sex marriage equality as something so positive. I think if we go back to some of the things that Ben was saying about homophobic bullying, there's still actually a massive disparity there, and in terms of having, I think somebody raised the issue earlier in terms of what difference will this bill make, and I think actually seeing it, there is something about having the concept of same-sex marriage and people being very supportive of that, but having the reality of it and being able to live with that, I think will have a massive impact on some of those people, some of those young people coming through who are either children of same-sex couples or who just are able to experience it on a social level, that it's something that is talked about, that is not hidden. So I think you'll see a shift with the polling being in support of same-sex marriage, a shift hopefully in the future where actually it's not just about same-sex marriage, but it's actually a recognition of same-sex couples and relationships being equal to opposite sex, and all of the social acceptance that comes along with that.
If I may just make two very brief points on the basis of tracking polling that we do in some detail. I think the two interesting points that have arisen from that is in fact the proportion of people who define themselves as people of faith is almost as high as the number who say they would support same-sex marriage in the general population. And the other thing where we're completely clear now because of tracking polling over a period of time, the other area where a discrepancy has sometimes been assumed but doesn't exist is between metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas. And the discrepancy is almost statistically insignificant. And it was instructive perhaps, that in Barnstable, where Any Questions was held a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Dymond will be asked the audience what they thought, and rather, it must be said to my surprise as well, 4 in 5 of the audience said they supported what the government was proposing to do. Barnstable is at the heart of Middle Britain. It's not Islington or Highbury or chic Kennington.
Simon Kirkby.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. Ben, there's been some suggestion that gay people don't want same-sex marriage. I know you've carried out some polling recently. Can you share that with us today?
Well, we polled 2,092 lesbian, gay and bisexual adults through YouGov, and that was a representative sample. 91% of people over 18, gay people over 18, supported the government, and that figure rose to 96% among gay people under 35.
Any other questions? As our invited witnesses, anything to say before we conclude? If there's no other questions, we have.
May I just say something very briefly about a question that I think Ben asked this morning about conversion costs?
Delighted, yeah.
We were slightly anxious that the response to the government's consultation suggested that the cost of a conversion from civil partnership to marriage might be in 3 figures, and I think our view is clearly if you want to go and occupy the registry office again for an hour and have the ceremony solemnised, that might be perfectly reasonable. But if all you're doing is sending in your certificate to be adjusted, to charge £120 seems unreasonable. And we did check the cost of replacement birth certificate or marriage certificate is £9.95. The cost of replacement driver's licence is £20, and as most of you will be aware, the cost of a replacement non-migratory trout and coarse rod fishing licence is £5. And it does seem to us the charge for simply reissuing a certificate that simply requires to be filled in and put in the post should not necessarily be in three figures or above.
Paula?
On the subject of polling, I don't think the polls have ever addressed the issue of, do you believe it's correct that people with strongly held marriage views on keeping our vows should be forced to divorce so that both parties can enjoy full civil participation? That's not been asked, and that should have been asked. I don't think people out there appreciate the position that trans people are in. Don't forget, we're being treated for a medical condition, and the final part of the medical treatment effectively is being let back into society with a GRC. And many of us are now living, if you like, on the edge of society, and we would delightfully have full participation, please.
And I think the only brief coda we don't to the government's consultation is we felt the economic impact assessment was relatively modest, given that most celebrants in weddings currently spend about £20,000, and Michael Bloomberg, the Mayor of New York, who will certainly be well known to some of you, did announce last July that as a consequence of the introduction of same-sex marriage, the City of New York had benefited economically to the tune of $259 million in 12 months. And mindful of the current economic situation and our difficulty in finding tools that might change things, committee members might wish to bear that in mind.
Okay. If members have no further questions of witnesses, we shall move to questions of the next panel of witnesses. We now hear oral evidence from Liberal Judaism and Board of Deputies of Jews. For the record, please would you... when you take your places. And thank you very much for your evidence this afternoon. For the record, could you please introduce yourselves to the committee?
Sarah Anticoni, Board of Deputies.
John Benjamin, Board of Deputies of British Jews.
Danny Rich, Liberal Judaism.
Okay. Ben Bradshaw?
I'd like to start by asking Danny Rich, if I may. We've heard from a number of religious representatives earlier today who based their opposition to the government's proposals for equal marriage on their reading of the Bible. I wondered how and why your reading of the Bible had led you to a different conclusion.
Well, I'll try and give you a short answer. It's a very difficult theological question. Essentially, we believe that we approach the Hebrew Scriptures not as though they're the Word of God directly dictated by God and written down by Moses, but as the record of our ancestors struggling to understand what God wanted them to do at the time. And that means they're a human document, which, by the way, makes them even more marvellous. If they were God's document, we'd expect them to be marvellous. The fact they're a human document, in fact, makes them even more marvellous as far as I'm concerned. But it does mean that their authors are the products of their environment, with all of the blind spots and other things that follow. So that would be the first point we'd say about Scripture in general. The second point we'd say about Scripture, of course, has many gaps in it. It's debatable whether Scripture understood that lesbians existed, as it were. Certainly understood that a particular activity carried out by certain men existed, and that's how we would understand some of the prohibitions that are used in that context. I mean, I can go further, but I'm as you wish, but I don't know if that's a helpful answer to begin with.
I mean, what you're talking about for a Christian theologian is revelation, basically, that you interpret Scripture in different times as a result of your experience.
We believe in progressive revelation, and that's a very trendy title, but what that essentially means is that no individual or group of people at any one time can claim to know wholly what God requires. And so our task in life is to try and be prayerful, of course, to study our Scriptures and to be respectful to them, but we might say Scripture has a voice but not a veto, if that's helpful.
It's a very good word, Danny.
Kate Green?
What difference will it make in terms of how people feel in their faith about the option to have a same-sex marriage, given that in legal terms there are very few differences between a same-sex marriage and a civil partnership?
Well, there's a lot of difference. One is it doesn't have a religious aspect to it. I mean, what some of our members want is to have their union, their relationship celebrated in the synagogue or in another building, but by their rabbi or in a religious setting. And so for them, they'll be delighted. I suspect that most of our other members, it will be a matter of indifference, or other than they can see a justice matter here. They've got members who aren't able to do something that other members can do.
Steve Williams.
Thank you, Mr. I have both a liberal progressive synagogue and a more orthodox synagogue, if I can put it that way, in my constituency in Bristol. What is the respective views in between the two denominations within Judaism? If a same-sex marriage is celebrated in the synagogue in Easton in Bristol, what will the view of Jews who do not go to that synagogue be of that marriage? Will it be recognised?
Yeah, well, I inducted, of course, your new rabbi there only a short while ago, Rabbi Monique Mayer. The answer is, of course, I can only speak for liberal Judaism, whom I represent, as it were, and I dare to suggest, and it may be that the Board of Deputies might wish to answer this, that other groups of Jews will not accept the validity of our marriages, but in a sense, that's their problem, not ours. We believe this is the right decision for those of our members who wish it. Indeed, I can't say that every single one of our members is supportive. When we first began looking at civil partnerships, we prepared, and I'd just been appointed the Chief Executive, we prepared this big PR and education campaign for our own communities, and it was a damn squib because none of them were that interested in it, because most of them were quite relaxed about it. But one of our synagogues took the view that this was not something they wished to be associated with. And it may well be that one or two of our rabbis and one or two of our communities don't feel able to do this themselves, and we've made it very clear to them that as a national organisation we want to be permissive to our congregation, but we don't wish to impose on any of our individual members or rabbis or congregations things that they don't feel in conscience they can do. But it would appear that the majority of our members, and I say would appear because we haven't polled every one of them, but from the indications that we're getting, that the majority of them are content that those gay men and lesbians who wish to do this, and where they've got rabbis and communities that wish to also be part of it, it should be allowed to happen. I don't expect, however, if I carried out a same-sex marriage in Bannerman Road this week, that our neighbouring synagogue would be whooping with delight. But that's not a matter that I can comment on.
The Board of Deputies is the cross-communal representative organisation for the Jewish community, so it does include as affiliates members of all the different denominations, and where they're not formally affiliated, such as the ultra-Orthodox, we certainly work with those parts of the community and represent them. There are many differences, theological differences, between different parts of the community. It's not necessarily acknowledged or recognised outside of the Jewish community, but there's a huge diversity of opinion on all manner of issues and theological ones, certainly. So there are all sorts of differences between the way the practices are undertaken in different synagogues, and the two synagogues in Bristol, I'm sure, would look at all manner of things, the way scriptures are read and who they're read by, and whether men and women sit together. There are so many areas of divergence, and it really is a matter of sort of live and let live. If you decide to be a member of that particular club, then you adhere to those rules, and the synagogue or the other golf club down the road or whatever it may be won't necessarily look to interfere. One of the things the board tries to do is to not only keep peace, but make sure we have sensible conversations amongst the different denominations on things that impact on the community generally. And in response to this, and obviously there is, as I say, divergent opinion on this as much as there is on anything else, we have put in a submission, as you've probably seen, that says, we want different parts of the community to be able to do what they want, or not be compelled to do what they don't want to do. So that is, the very simple sort of consensus and acceptable position that hopefully we've adopted for everyone. So I don't think, obviously when it comes to legally, a marriage recognised as civil, in terms of the civil authorities will recognise a marriage, so no one from a more orthodox synagogue will say you're not married, and the fact that they're not married in a sort of ceremony that they would recognise in their own synagogue or according to their own practices wouldn't really be a matter of great issue, I don't think.
But I think a live and let live must go both ways. And I think we're not seeking to impose on members of the Jewish community or anybody else things they don't wish to do, but we are hoping that the legislation will permit those members of ours who do wish to be able to carry out what the legislation will permit them to do.
We are in a slightly anomalous position to the extent that, as with the Quakers, we have a combined religious and civil service, civil marriage service. And so, unlike other members of other communities who have to have a civil marriage followed by a religious blessing or the other way around, we have a combined service. And by supporting the government's position and allowing this to take place for those that wish to opt in and those that don't wish to, not being compelled to do so, we're fortunate our breadth of our community can be accommodated.
Jim Shannon.
Thanks for coming along. Can I ask you a couple of questions? The first one is in relation to Liberal Judaism. I just want to get my head around the numbers that you represent. Is Liberal Judaism, how do you compare with your numbers today, for instance, like 10 years ago or 20 years ago? And the second question is in relation to I have been in touch with some Orthodox Jews who have stated very clearly that they're opposed to the redefinition of marriage. I'm just wondering how you would reconcile your opinion that you've presented to this committee today as against those of the Orthodox Jews who have a very different opinion from what they've told me.
In terms of the numbers, Rabbi Rich will put me right. I think Liberal Judaism currently counts about 10,000 members. The most recent, obviously the census figures came out recently not for Scotland and Northern Ireland, but there are around about 260, 270,000 Jews who admitted to being Jews in the voluntary question in the census. So that gives you an idea of the proportions.
So the Liberal Judaism represents about 10,000 of the
Liberal Judaism, but there are other progressive denominations within Judaism who would look favourably on the changes in the law as well.
And how would those numbers, ask the question, how would those numbers compare with, say, 10 years ago for your Liberal Judaism? Would you have had more numbers 10 years ago?
I can answer on Liberal Judaism. I'm delighted to say that the statistics carried out very, very independently by the Board of Deputies show that we are growing slightly. I think synagogue affiliations as a whole, except in one section of the community, are probably dropping. But anyway, that the Board will comment on that. But ours are growing slightly. Right. I can't say that we have overwhelmingly converted either the whole of the Jewish population or indeed others, but we're seeing good growth in our communities.
10,000 out of a 270,000 Jewish numbers wouldn't be representative of all the Jewish people.
Well, so let's be clear, 250,000, half of them are not affiliated to any synagogue.
No, I understand that.
So they might equally be affiliated to ours as to any other one, but they choose not to be affiliated to anyone. So I don't think I agree, we're the third largest synagogal organisation after the United Synagogue and the Reform Movement, and our sister Reform Movement, which represents about 25,000, has indicated support for the government measure. So I would say that something like a third of Jews who affiliate to synagogues are indicative or are supportive. But I accept that how you cut the statistics is always a difficult one.
Lies, damn lies and statistics.
Mr. Shannon, the witnesses are more fortunate. They're nearer to you and can hear you. I can't.
Absolutely.
Could you speak in the direction of the microphone, please?
Yeah, I referred to lies, damn lies and statistics. The question I want to ask was the Orthodox Jews, they've stated to me their opposition to the redefinition of marriage. That's my second question. Could you give us some idea how you reconcile your opinion with their opinion?
We have something of a mandate to speak for the Jewish community, including the majority who are Orthodox Jews. In relation to this consultation, I think there were submissions that were made by parts of the Orthodox community and other parts that chose not to speak out. We have deliberately not adopted a view that would cause any problem or any controversy within the Jewish community, because there is simply no single view. So our submission and our position has been that those who wish to opt in should be able to do so. Those who choose not to should also have that freedom. If you were to go to any Orthodox synagogue, certainly sort of mainstream Orthodox, which is possibly a slightly confusing term, but fairly middle of the road, not ultra Orthodox, you would again find people of varying opinions who are very accepting of the proposals, just as Rabbi Rich said, even within a liberal synagogue you may find people who are not so comfortable. So there's a vast range of opinion. And I think it's true to say, and I've had this conversation with Anglicans and Catholics as well, being a relatively small community and one that enjoys a great deal of freedom and tolerance in this country, we are not looking to say to British people generally, to the social fabric, that this is what has to happen in terms of marriage. There are certainly Jewish thinkers and theologians who will have a strong view about what marriage means. but we're not looking to impose our views on the wider public. We just want to be able to, as in so many things, be able to do what we want to do as a community, whether it's kosher food or circumcision, or in this case, conduct ourselves and our family lives as we can.
Stuart Andrew.
Can I ask you if you think that, as the law stands currently, that it upholds the principles of religious freedom?
Well, clearly the law is looking, the proposed changes in the law go further, and I suppose freedom is in the eye of the beholder. People will be able to do things in future if the law changes that they can't do at the moment. So I suppose that accords greater freedom. It hasn't been a major issue within the community, a discussion, which is possibly why we can adopt such a sort of sitting on the fence or trying to be all things to all people kind of view. That there's been a great deal of angling for a change in the law. There are obviously Jewish, lesbian, gay and transgender groups that want to see this. And if the opportunities come along, then different parts of the community will embrace it or not as they choose to. I don't think it's been a major campaigning point.
Chris Bryant. Sorry.
I just wanted to...
liberal to...
yeah.
Sorry.
That kind of liberal rather than...
Okay. Carry on, please.
I just wanted to hear from the rabbi, please.
Okay.
Well, I think, religious freedom, of course, needs definition. For our members, we would see this an advance in our religious freedom. Currently, we're not permitted to do something. We don't understand why the law doesn't permit us to do it when it doesn't have as far as we perceive, a harmful impact on anybody else. In some senses, it's a private matter which is brought into the public domain, if I can use that. And I suppose if you were to push me really to the brink, and we were starting again, and we're not starting again, I would say that civil society ought to register marriages and allow religions to do, and allow mad people, or not mad people, if you consider religious people to be mad, to do whatever they like within reason. That would be my ultimate. That the state has a responsibility to register marriages, clearly for purpose of inheritance and all sorts of purposes why the state requires to do so. And as you know, on the continent, you then get your certificate from the registering authority. I think it's the mayor in many places. You go off and have a synagogue wedding or a church wedding or any wedding that you choose. But we're not there, partly because we have an established church, which is not my issue or problem. So therefore we're faced with a different situation. But in the current situation, I would argue that what's being proposed does increase religious freedom for those who wish it.
I mean, it would be a retrograde step, obviously, if parts of the community were then compelled to do something they don't want to do, because clearly that would impact on their religious freedoms.
So do you think that the quadruple lock is sufficient then?
Well, that's a different question.
There are concerns, and we have raised those in the discussions we've had with those who are drafting. It's quadruple, although some of the locks don't in fact impact upon our community. I think we've got probably a triple rather than a quadruple lock. I'm afraid it's one of those things where time will tell. We're going with what's drafted. We've suggested some additional drafting on who will be effectively the supervisory governing body. But other than that, we'll have to wait and see. We're reassured that to date there haven't been those tests in European courts. But
the evidence we heard today was from Panic he certainly wanted to give the impression of being categorical, and he was effectively saying if anybody wanted to come to him as a client, he'd be saying, look, your case is hopeless. It's not going to go anywhere, and it's not going to go anywhere now, and it's not going to go anywhere in 10 years' time. But can I ask you, for 6 years I was a vicar in the Church of England. I married about 120 people. It seemed to me that the bit that was truly valuable to people, apart from the individual commitment, was actually the moment of ceremony. You're the first people who've referred to ceremony at all today. And actually, for people who enter into civil partnerships, it's very difficult to come across suitable material for ceremonies. Now, I presume you would use the chuppah and the breaking of the glass and all those similar things. Is that right?
Well, the answer is yes, and of course, if you read my introductory note, which I'm sure you did, as all members do, you will have seen that we produced what we called a covenant of love, a liturgy for such circumstances. So we have created a liturgy. I think we can't prove it, we're probably the first synagogue organisation in the world to produce such a liturgy. So we're trying to get ourselves ahead of the game. But you're absolutely right. That was the distinction I tried to make between civil partnerships and marriage. Marriage is about having God involved for those who want it, having their rabbi involved, their community involved. It's very different from a civil partnership. And we have sought to reflect that in our liturgy. And you're right in saying some of the symbols that we would wish to do.
In fact, when civil partnerships were going through, some of us tried to get the government to allow ceremonies as part of the civil partnership, and it's in theory at least not allowed. Though most registrars will allow something, but I mean, it's one of the things I hope that would change significantly. But I just wonder, you referred to live and let live, great principle. You could say it's one of the fundamental principles of the bill in a way, as a permissive bill. But I just wonder how you manage that, because one Jewish friend of mine told his family that he was gay. His sister, I guess in the terms that you've used, would describe herself as ultra-Orthodox. She has now performed a funeral service for him. She no longer believes that he is alive. And how do you therefore ensure that you have that if you're going to cover such a broad set of opinions from yours to that extreme?
Well, of course, one can always take extreme examples to try and create a scare. But the reality, I didn't get an opportunity to answer the previous question, which is similar, that those Jews who want this type of ceremony will not be knocking on the doors of synagogues and rabbis that reject them. The answer is go to synagogues and rabbis that want you. And I don't quite understand why that isn't the response to, in every case. If your church doesn't want you, or doesn't recognise you, or has an issue with you, and you can't resolve that through your theology with your vicar or your liturgy, then there are plenty of other churches you can go to where that's possible. And I think similarly, it's very tragic when families, we don't want families to be divided over any of these issues, but in fact they will be, because people have strong views, and people in families can have strong views. None of us here, I'm sure, would support the idea that if your brother's gay, somehow you have a funeral, not have a funeral service, but you have morning prayers and somehow discount them. And we can only hope that eventually the community will learn. At one time, when Jews married non-Jews, people sat shiva for their child. I think that's not very common in many of our mainstream communities, and I think we learn to live with new situations. And these extreme cases are often used to create moral panics and scares, which I have said all along. I mean, initially, I don't think one of the fears in our community is that suddenly we'd be swamped with every gay Jew wanting to say, well, delightful if they would, and everybody else who wants to convert likewise. But in reality, it wasn't going to be true, and of course, it wasn't true. A number of once we went to civil partnerships, a number of those people who had civil partnerships then came to us and had ceremonies, but they didn't overwhelm the rabbis. I mean, would that any rabbi were overwhelmed with pastoral demands? But they just weren't. And that was the reality. And I think the reality will be here that those who want them will find the synagogues and perhaps the churches and other places where they can be made to feel comfortable, and that seems to be right and proper. And the state shouldn't be preventing people doing what they can find comfortable, and that the local rabbi and the local community thinks is right in their own context.
Mr. Quate?
Very grateful for your full answer, but I'd like to get back to the question that was posed earlier with regard to the legal basis of the bill, because obviously we've had Mr. David Panik's view, but we know that lawyers are very litigious, and other lawyers will give you other views. I mean, to what extent, how comfortable are you that you will be not faced by any legal challenge, given what's actually written in the bill that we're considering?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, of course, and I can go to two lawyers, and certainly if they're Jewish, they'll give me three different opinions.
Two Jewish lawyers, yes.
But you've got lawyers sitting to my left who may be able to answer that question. My own organisation is not fearful of that. We believe that if there are rabbis and communities that feel unable to take up this legislation, then we will find a way to get those congregants to go to different rabbis and different synagogues. We do it now. One of our rabbis is opposed to, we have ceremonies that involve a Jew and a non-Jew. One of our rabbis is opposed to that. We have what I think is a perfectly reasonable agreement with him that he refers couples to one of our other rabbis. Now it seems to me that with a bit of common sense, and not people who are over litigious and want to prove something against church, except there may well be churches and synagogues, we certainly in our organisation will find a way to deal with those people, and there are some small number of our members who do not find this very comfortable. And our task must be to try and respect their opinion, to make them feel as comfortable as possible, but not to deny to others on the basis that they feel comfortable something which others feel is legitimate. And that's the only answer I can give you, but the lawyers to my left might want to give you a different answer.
Well, I think the capacity to sort of refer someone or a couple to a part of the community, and they probably would know this anyway, will actually help deal with the problem. Obviously, I'm encouraged if Lord Panic this morning said that any claim would be next to hopeless, because as someone who used to be a litigation lawyer, the mere sort of fact of a sort of vexatious or nuisance claim could cause a lot of problems for some of our institutions. Even if they were ultimately likely to win, they would still have to instruct lawyers and incur expense and so forth. But I think the capacity to find a part of the community that will be accommodating to you, and for people to understand that if you're talking about an Orthodox synagogue where there are certain practices, men and women sit separately, and very traditional Judaism in that respect, it's quite likely that someone who is gay will possibly embrace that mode of Judaism and would want to have some kind of recognition of their relationship in that kind of synagogue, but quite possibly also would be more sort of liberal or progressive in their outlook, and would find a home in a different part of the community. And there are different sort of gradations of the community as well: Masorti, Reform, Liberal, Progressive. So I think chances are that they would find a home. But in terms of the technicalities of the triple or quadruple lock, as Sir Antigone said, we will just have to see. And we can't be sure. And our concern would simply be that there aren't nuisance claims thrown against synagogues or synagogue movements that they would have to investigate and defend, even if ultimately they weren't successful.
Thank you.
Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Chris.
Okay. David Burrows.
Yes. Schools, in terms of Jewish schools, could you just indicate what impact you think may happen as a result of the bill in relation to, I think, for example, the school in my patch, Warson Hillel, linked to United Synagogue, and they may well be a view that's linked to the view of that synagogue. They may well have a view that they will only recognise marriage in the traditional view of marriage being between a man and a woman, and that's what they would want to teach as well. How do you think that will be impacted by the bill?
Well, faith schools obviously also have religious authority to whom they can defer when determining who is or is not of the faith. And several years ago, and Lord Panic was actually involved, there was a case involving Jewish Free School. And there were a wealth, and I gave evidence in that case. The Board of Deputies, again, it was another instance when, although there was some communal difficulties, intracommunal difficulties, the Board of Deputies managed to hopefully play a positive part in helping the court understand the different traditions within the community without taking sides. But depending on how the question is phrased and which religious authority is making the determination...
So we're talking GFS, we're talking quite a traditional-based school, Jewish school in primary school.
A child's parents do not have to be married necessarily to determine the religious status of the child. And
in terms of at school, the teaching of the school children, do you think this bill will impact upon the freedom of the teachers in that Jewish school in Southgate?
If I could answer that, I am a governor of a faith primary school, and I think the answer is that curriculum will always be reviewed on a regular basis, but in line with the ethos of the school. So I think the recognition of the reality of other ways of forming friendships will be something which will have to be addressed, whether or not the religious authority, as John has mentioned, the school is under that auspices, whether or not in their community those marriages would in fact be carried out may or not be the case, but the spectrum of the possibilities would certainly, and certainly at secondary school, would be covered.
We're involved with schools that have a number of different movements across communal schools, so there clearly are differences in some of those. And I think the difference is teachers, of course, can teach that there's a wide range of practice. Doesn't mean they have to support them. And I think that's an important distinction that teachers will have. I defer to my lawyers again, but must have some protection against. They clearly have obligations to teach about a wide range. So in the schools that are Reform, Liberal, Masorti, for example, they teach across a wide range of what Judaism represents. But the teacher, him or herself, may be a Masorti Jew or a Reform Jew or a Liberal Jew or something entirely different. And indeed, it matters Jewish status. So they may have to say, Liberal Judaism takes a different view about who is a Jew. If they're then asked by a parent or a child or somebody, are you a Liberal Jew who believes in that? The answer may well be no. We wouldn't have a problem with that, provided our view were fairly represented. And I think there's a distinction between what teachers have to teach, and which can be wide-ranging, and their own personal views, which they have entitlement to express.
Just pick up, you mentioned earlier about the concerns you've been addressing with officials in relation to the bill. And obviously, with the Bill Committee looking at the bill, could you just amplify some of those particular concerns in terms of drafting?
Very specific drafting which has been submitted, but it related to the definition of relevant governing authority. I go back to the answer I gave about how Jewish marriages are slightly different to other religions other than Quakers. So we have a combined ceremony. And so when one wishes to marry in accordance with the Jewish faith, but as part of a civil marriage as well, you register under the auspices of, and currently there are 3 relevant governing authorities, which we are using now as a good opportunity to clarify into 5, because there are different strands, and when we originally had the exception to the Marriage Act, we're talking about 19th century marital legislation, 1836 onwards. It now being 2013, we thought clarity was probably a good thing, and it certainly, in terms of chain of command, would assist that if there was any challenge, subject to Mr. Panik's view, if there were any challenges, then it would be clear as to under whose auspices the particular marriage would have taken place. Currently, most marriages are under the auspices of the Chief Rabbi of the United Hebrew Congregation, and then there is also the West London Synagogue, now known for the purposes going forward, will be Movement for Reform Judaism, and then, as Rabbi Rich points out, the Liberal community and Liberal Judaism will have as a separate entity, so they will be under their auspices.
Mr. Burrows?
What's the view of the Chief Rabbi?
I think he may have made public comments, but I can't...
Be good to hear them.
Sorry?
Be good to hear them.
It may indeed. I don't recall what they were. I mean, I don't believe... it would be unfair to represent or misrepresent his views. Well, none of us speak for him.
The main leader of the Jewish community.
I think he did make a statement that marriage is between a man and a woman, didn't he?
Yes, I know.
That was his understanding of it.
Fairly unsurprising view.
So be it from him.
Mr. Bradshaw?
Sarah and John, just a couple of points. Returning to this issue of the fear of litigation, has there been a successful challenge in Spain or any of the other European Union countries on a synagogue forcing them? There haven't been any. Okay.
Not so far as we're aware. And the trouble is a reliance upon no other precedents.
Yeah.
As lawyers, one never feels particularly reassured by that. But it's quite right. I mean, there has been same-sex marriage in Holland for years and other European countries, and there haven't been successful challenges against those religious authorities.
And my second question was, given that we've just heard that liberal Judaism is the only growing part of Jewish religious practice in this country, are you, as representatives of the board, not worried that you will lose more members by your opposition to same-sex marriage to his lot?
Well, we're not opposing it, as I said.
But by not offering it?
Liberal Judaism is part of the Board of Deputies. Another rapidly growing part of the community is the ultra-Orthodox community, who tend to have many more children than liberal or any other types of Jews. So the Board of Deputies encompasses in all these parts of the community, so it's not a challenge to us, and we have embraced the practices that every different denomination within the community wants to pursue, including that of the Liberals, the Masorti, Reform and Orthodox.
Stephen Williams.
Thank you. My earlier question about British practice to the international situation, Rabbi Danny said earlier that you were developing
As an organisation. We are part of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which is in fact the largest synagogal organisation in the world, representing about 1.8 million, most of whom are in the United States. So we have a very large sister organisation in the States. And, you know, different things happen in the States. There's a lot more autonomy for synagogues, a lot less control over marriages. So there are synagogues that are doing them, but they haven't produced a national liturgy for that purpose. That's the point I was making.
So to follow on from that, so are there a large number of same-sex marriages celebrated in synagogues in the States?
I would suspect so. I mean, the truth of the matter is I'm responsible only for Ireland.
What I'm trying to get at, Mr. Hood, would a same-sex marriage in a British synagogue be a world first, or are you following precedent elsewhere?
I think the problem is I think the legal question is slightly different, isn't it? Because I think in the States, I think you get married by your local state and then have a synagogue. I mean, when I contracted one marriage in the States, I simply had to sign a bit of paper when I got there, so I didn't quite know. So the answer is I don't know.
That was Las Vegas then.
No, it wasn't actually. It was the Sonoma Valley, even better.
Perhaps I can ask it another way, Mr. Hood. Is there acceptance and recognition then amongst Jewish communities elsewhere outside this country of same-sex marriage?
Yes.
Right.
Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Can I'm probably just missing something that's obvious here. Can I try and understand the process point in terms of governing structures and how a mainstream part of the faith would go through a process which led them to opting into the legislation, potentially? I don't know if Sarah or John could just briefly talk me through that, and then I do have a short question for Rabbi Rich as well.
Without leading you to the specific drafting, which would be somewhat dull, by dividing the community up into different, effectively, ecclesiastical authorities that would be the authority which would supervise the religious and civil marriage, those that wish to carry out, and liberal Judaism have already indicated that's what they would wish to do, so they would opt in and they would carry out such marriages, and other parts of the community that have indicated that they do not wish to at the current time would not, and therefore they wouldn't be forced to have to carry out such marriages. But they then could, the legislation would be sufficiently flexible so that if their positions changed at any stage, and I think we've all seen that positions within a broad church can change from time to time over periods of years and as society develops, that there could be movements, so people could then, different communities could opt in if necessary.
But that structure essentially carries on what's gone before. It's just been redefined for 2013.
But that's helpful, Mr. Hood, because whilst I understand the point Rabbi Rich is making about the pick and mix approach from a consumer's perspective, that if you don't like the synagogue or they don't like you, don't go there, go somewhere else. One of the questions I wanted to ask is what assessment you guys have made of protections for members of staff that you have, not just the celebrants, the rabbis themselves who are on the face of the bill, but other members of paid staff from different synagogues who might not be so easily able to go somewhere else because that's where their job is. I'm keen to make sure that they're protected too. Is your assessment that the bill does protect their religious conscience?
I mean, in practical terms, the people who are involved with our synagogues, marriages, are the rabbi and the marriage secretary, both of whom are members of our synagogues. So we don't see a problem with... Now, in theory, I suppose, you could have a rabbi's PA, and the rabbi's PA were asked to do something. I mean, I think the answer would be that the synagogue would... I mean, I can't answer the legal question, obviously the lawyers... I can't imagine one of our synagogues would be in a position where it would seek to force one of its employees to do something that they, in their conscience, didn't want to do. That's by the nature of our organisation. And by the way, we have... some of our synagogues employ Orthodox members of staff who require additional time off, which we don't count as Jewish holidays, for example. We have had no case that in all of our history that I know of where a member of staff has had to take action on that basis. That's all I can say.
I think ultimately legally, I would imagine that if you currently carried out the role of secretary of a synagogue with the registrar's function and either didn't wish to carry out same-sex marriages that were in a synagogue where they were to be celebrated, I think that would be an individual decision. I don't see as a body that that's an overall concern. We certainly haven't taken particular soundings from the registrars.
No, I mean, in our submission, in our response to the consultation, we do specifically say that these would be internal matters. It may be a synagogue, although it obviously comes down to individual views, it may be a synagogue within a movement that is uncomfortable. Perhaps, a number of its congregants have voiced a concern, and we looked at the issue in drafting terms of sort of devolving down or devolving up, pushing up the decision, whether it should be the sort of movement-wide, the denomination-wide. That's ultimately where we came down to, because they will be setting, normally very much in tandem and in consultation with their members and their member congregations, the kind of policy they would like to apply. But beyond that, whether it's individual synagogues or even individual members of staff, those should be internal matters, and obviously, it's in no one's interest to see people being prosecuted or disciplined or losing their jobs. And I just don't think that that's the kind of view that employers would want to take. They would be as understanding as they possibly could be.
Any other questions? Is there anything that our witnesses would like to say that they haven't already said, they feel they could say? It would be helpful to the committee. Well, can I thank you very sincerely for your evidence today. I'm sure the committee will make good use of it in its deliberations, and thank you very much for coming. And I'm afraid we now come to the end of this session, and I understand that our next panel are available, and the evidence comes from the out of marriage. And Freudian slip. Gentlemen, for the record, could you please introduce yourselves to the committee?
Okay, so I'm Benjamin Cohen. I started the Out for Marriage campaign. I'm also the publisher of Pink News, gay and lesbian publication. Want to say before James introduces himself that we're just volunteers. We're not a professional organisation. We're just a group of LGBT people who one day want to get married.
I'm James J. Walsh, and I am the Director of Campaigns for Out for Marriage. By night and by day I work in the voluntary sector in another role.
Anyone ask questions? Kate Green?
Yes, can I ask you, given that there's little legal difference between civil partnership and marriage, same-sex marriage, what you see as the importance of legislation to allow same-sex couples to marry?
Thank you.
I think actually just the last evidence you had pinpoints it, being able to have a religious marriage. Not everyone wishes to have a civil partnership. Also, it's about equality and about freedom. If the state has already said that it's okay for two people of the same sex to be in a relationship together, to live together, to be in a sexual relationship together, that they are equal, they should have the same rights and the same rights to get married. I also personally think that, when we think about children being bullied in school, it is not possible to say to the people doing the bullying, well, gay people are the same as straight people, if they don't ultimately have the same rights to have the same relationship structures. And one of the first people to make an Out for Marriage video, and we started as a campaign where people recorded videos onto YouTube, were my grandparents. And my grandparents support same-sex marriage because they'd like me one day to be able to get married to my boyfriend in exactly the same structure and the same status as they did, and my parents did. James?
Yeah, there's also some technical aspects that relate to marriage internationally. If I decided to have a civil partnership and then I decided to move to Portugal, where same-sex marriages are legal, my civil partnership wouldn't be recognised there. So there's some international differences that we need to be aware of as well in playing this out.
I think also, as also been illustrated, the issue of transgender people and the fact that their marriages are taken away and forced to have civil partnerships if they go through gender reassignment, something that the Civil Partnership Act didn't really consider. And I think the other thing is that society has moved on a lot since the introduction of civil partnerships. Many people were happy when they were introduced and did refer to them as gay marriages, but they weren't marriage. And I think the word marriage is really important. And I'm not going to, even when me and my boyfriend decide to get married, I'm not going to bend down and say, please, will you be my partner or my civil partner? It sounds like I'm going to open a firm of accountants or lawyers. I don't want to have a partner, I want to have a husband, and that's what I would ask.
Stuart Andrew.
Thank you. Can I ask you, are you happy with the bill as it is at the moment, or do you think actually this discussion that we've had about civil partnerships being extended to heterosexual couples is something that needs to be debated further?
Okay. Out for Marriage believes this bill is not about LGBT rights primarily. It's about religious freedom. Now, if we are in a state that believes that you can be of religion or without religion, then civil partnerships need to be thought about clearly, because there are some people in this world that do not want to have a religious marriage ceremony. We don't represent them, but the ethic sticks. The principle sticks for us that actually, as a group, if there is one set of rules for the LGBT community where they can have a non-religious commitment,
or they choose not to get married and call it a marriage. I think that actually, it would be a bit perverse if gay people suddenly got more rights than straight people, and suddenly, having been maybe it'd be quite a nice compensation for the fact that we've been discriminated against for hundreds of or thousands of years, and then suddenly we have more rights. But it would seem a bit odd if same-sex couples can choose between a civil partnership and a marriage, given that civil partnerships were created as sort of legal fudge, were created because people were convinced that it would go through Parliament to call something a marriage. It was really a marriage, but it just wasn't called it and didn't have exactly the same rights. So while we haven't been standing there campaigning for civil partnerships, if they were to be retained, I can understand. I think most of LGBT people can understand that some heterosexual people may wish to have them, and in some countries, among the straight community, not among the gay community, civil partnerships and their equivalents are becoming more popular than marriage.
Interesting. Ben Bradshaw?
Can I commend both of you for using the word freedom in your opening sentences, which is a very refreshing change from the way that this debate is often framed. But Mr. Walsh, you talked about the issue of rights in other countries. Am I not right in saying that depends on that other country's law and jurisdiction? Do you actually have evidence that shows that if I were in a same-sex marriage, that my husband and I would enjoy more rights in another country than we currently do or would in a civil partnership? And then a question to both of you on the issue we've asked other witnesses about how you feel about the change in the consummation provisions in the bill as it stands.
Okay, coming back specifically on the question asked to me, and I know that Ben has also indicated he'd like to reply on that too. It's my understanding that those countries that have already legalised same-sex marriage, and then the person has then gone and emigrated to Portugal, for instance, they enjoy full legal marriage entitlement. Portugal is very strange in that it doesn't recognise civil partnerships but does recognise same-sex marriage. So actually there is a difference, and we would have greater rights internationally.
Actually, in Israel, a country which doesn't allow same-sex marriage to be performed within the country, does recognise them that are performed outside, but does not recognise civil partnership. And there are actually many Jewish couples that might want to make Aliyah, might want to emigrate to Israel, but their marital status is not recognised that come from here, that's simply because they can't translate the word civil partnership. And so couples from Israel have to go, or British couples that wish to go and move there and have the tax status and other statuses there, have to go to Canada or other countries that do offer same-sex marriage, because that country will recognise it. So there is actual, I think, quite strong evidence, and it seems logical that if a country also like France, when France has same-sex marriage, and it's likely they will introduce it, they also have civil pacts which have less rights than a same-sex marriage will have. I don't know how they would approach a British civil partnership. Would they consider them to be a same-sex marriage, or would they instead consider them to be a civil pact with slightly less, well, considerably less rights than same-sex marriage? Consummation, I think, would you like to?
Consummation. The heterosexual community seems very obsessed by the way that we consummate our marriages. Consummation is different for every LGBT couple. There is no need to be sexually active or inactive in a relationship, and I don't think that we should be legislating for that. From my point of view is when we have weddings that are carried out last minute because someone's on their deathbed, they're not consummated. So we do have some sort of precedent in law. And I think that the whole issue in itself needs to be just put to one side, because I think actually what people do in the privacy of their own bedroom is their own business.
But does that mean you prefer the bill as it originally stood, or in its changed form post-consultation on this issue? Or do you want to have a think about that?
As an organisation, we haven't come to a viewpoint on that one.
No, to be honest, I think it's a bit of a... I'm not sure why everyone's so obsessed with it. I mean, there are some issues.
It won't stop them talking about it up there.
No, of course, but I mean, also the issue. I think, for example, say Church of England clergy. There is indications that they would be able to enter into potentially same-sex marriage as long as it's celibate. Well, what happens to them if you had to consummate the marriage? They wouldn't be able to be married.
David Burrows.
And also just to talk about freedom. In terms of freedom and issues around freedom of conscience, in terms of the Pink News, do you think your forum should be free to help foment, or not help, but just allow for the fomenting of hostility, hatred and accusations of homophobia for people like me who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman and there's a distinctive value of it?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So in terms of, for people like me with my view,
yeah,
should people be free just to...
What to disagree with someone who opposes their right to get married?
No, please disagree. No. But on Pink News, for example, just as an example, where there's been a fomenting of hostility and hatred and abuse.
I mean, people are entitled to respond, I suppose, to what an MP says in their own way. But I don't think that's what we're encouraging.
No, I wouldn't say you are. But so, how do we protect? Do you think there's any ways that needs to be additional to the bill that we protect the freedom of conscience for people?
Well, I think that people are able to say, and I can't see anything in the bill which says anyone would have to agree to people having same-sex marriage. People talk a lot about their marriages being redefined. It's not redefining marriages that already exist. If I got married as a result of this bill, it doesn't actually affect... I live next door to a Catholic church. It doesn't affect the people who go and celebrate in that Catholic church. It doesn't affect what the priest who lives opposite me has to do. It doesn't affect anyone else, really, other than other same-sex couples. So I don't think that there is still the freedom, and I think that people have absolute liberty to disagree with this and to have their own views on homosexuality or anything else, because we live in a tolerant, liberal society where people can have different views. I'm Jewish, and I have some of my friends are very Orthodox Jews, and they would disagree with me driving on a Saturday, but that doesn't stop them being friends with me. And me disagreeing with their view that you can't drive on a Saturday doesn't stop me having respect for them.
I appreciate that, but you can distinguish between people's views in relation to homosexuality and people's views in relation to marriage.
What do you mean?
In terms of someone's views in relation to marriage and upholding a traditional view of marriage may well not mean that they are homophobic, that they have views against homosexuality. you accept there are distinctions?
Well, it depends whether those views presumably would mean that that one would believe in freedom, and the freedom for people to decide whether to get married or not, or whether for religious ministers to be able to perform them. It also would mean, I assume, that those individuals that I do not understand actually how one can say, as it happens, I am not homophobic, I have nothing against homosexuals, but they can't get married. Because it really means, well, I like them, they can do whatever they want, but they can't have the same rights that I have. I mean, people used to do that. People used to have, Jewish people used to have less rights. Black people used to have less rights. All sorts of people used to have less rights because of who they were and for things they couldn't help. And so to try and argue that, I am not homophobic, but I don't believe you should be able to have the right to do something, I can't quite get.
So you'd say I'm homophobic?
Well, I'm not saying you are, but I'm saying if you're arguing, I'm not going to have an argument with you about whether.
No, don't use it. But more to the point for the bill, in terms of the motivation behind it, and the, do you see it in terms of issues of acceptance and state and understanding in relation to homosexual relationships as a primary reason, or do you see the issue of establishing legal rights as a primary reason?
I mean, I think it's about rights, and I think it's also about making sure that same-sex people in same-sex relationships are equal in society. And of course, you stood for election on the Conservative Party's Equalities Manifesto that promised to consult on that. So that's maybe one of the reasons some people, some LGBT people, might vote Conservative. But I think that it's doing both of the things that you're saying. It is trying to redress rights. But it's also trying to, I would hope, foster a different sort of society where a young person growing up who is discovering or realising that they are gay today will realise that they will grow up and be able to have exactly the same rights and life as their parents or their grandparents, not to suddenly go down a different path, the path of civil partnerships.
From my point of view, we need to be very clear here that this is about rights and about balancing rights. And there is a way that someone who can disagree with same-sex marriage, because they have a traditional view of marriage, that allows for everyone to be happy. It's the way in which that person disagrees that is often the cause of thoughts around homophobia. So actually, if you were to present yourself in the incitement to hatred way of disagreeing with same-sex marriage, then yes, you would be homophobic. If you were to say that actually my religious convictions mean that I cannot accept same-sex marriage, but peace be with you, that's perfectly acceptable to us.
I mean, I have very strong religious beliefs that it's wrong to eat bacon and it's wrong to eat pork, but I don't stop my boyfriend from doing that because he's not Jewish. And I think that having your own religious beliefs is something separate, and I think that most of gay people would have a respect for people who do have religious reasons. The scriptures saying one thing, but this is also about civil rights and about civil marriage as well as religious marriage, and the state's role is slightly different to the religion's role.
Stephen Williams.
Thank you, Mr. When you were putting together your campaign, Out for Marriage, and I recorded a video for it in the early days as well, did you have sort of ground rules as a sort of follow-on to what David Burrows was asking? Did you set yourself ground rules of what the tone of the campaign would be? Was it to be a positive campaign or a negative campaign?
Yeah, we only ever really wanted a positive campaign. Actually, it works better politically, on social media, which is our main function, and it works better as key messaging out there. So actually it's that I'm coming out for marriage, which was our slogan, if you like, that we chose because it's actually a positive and accepting statement rather than I hate X because he doesn't like me because I'm gay. That just doesn't work.
We really did just want something positive, and that's the reason we started it was, if I'm honest, I don't think that up until the time that we started that last year, there were really any positive campaigns. What we were seeing were very negative campaigns led by religious organisations and other organisations that campaign against marriage. But what we weren't hearing was normal people saying, well, MPs, I mean, I would consider you to be normal as well, but normal people like my grandparents, and also celebrities. We've had all sorts of celebs and business leaders recording videos for us. It was just to show that that this is a positive thing and that it positively impacts on society, and that society is better if everyone has the same rights and if everyone is able to enter into stable relationships.
What sort of feedback have you received from the public, gay or otherwise?
Well, it depends. The most liked video of a non-celebrity actually is two mums from down in Deptford, where I'm living near, and they speak about their gay couple friends that they know, and their kids go to school together. It's a beautiful video. They're both heterosexual women. They're talking about actually they don't understand as a heterosexual couple who've never really been involved in the gay world, why their two friends that are great dads, their adopted kids, can't have the same rights as them, and why they can't, when they tell their kids about growing up in the family structure, that they can't describe it in the same kind of way. And that's actually our most shared video, followed by Ben's grandparents as well. And actually the argument around the age difference and the perception around younger and it being a younger person's, young people tend to be more accepting towards same-sex marriage. Actually, I tend to disagree. Older people as well, once you have the conversation with them and you talk about the tradition and the value of marriage and the things that they actually perceive it as being positive and good institution, actually they really come round to that point of view, and that's quite nice as well.
Especially if they like their grandchildren to get married while they're still alive, and not have to wait 20 or 30 years for the law to be changed.
And finally, Mr. Hood, if I can ask another one. Our next set of witnesses are from the Coalition for Marriage. No doubt you studied their campaign tactics. Were there any you thought you could have successfully deployed, or were there campaign tactics that you specifically rejected that they've deployed?
Well, I mean, the fact is also about money. I mean, we're just a group of, Out for Marriage is just a group of individuals who've used social media and used being able to get stories in the newspaper, and they've been, out videos, whether it's Hugh Grant or Richard Branson, they've got quite a lot of media coverage, but that's all we've had. We've had no money put into this. So yes, if we'd have had tens of thousands of pounds to throw at leaflet campaigns all around the country for them people to write to their MPs, to have polls, to have a petition on the webs, to have petitions on the website that hundreds of thousands of people sign up, some of which because they're encouraged to at school. There are different. The Catholic Educational Service was founded on that, and so it's not something to laugh at. So there are, but I don't. It's different tactics, different argument. We're in a different position. And it's one of the reasons why the gay community or the LGBT community's lobbying hasn't been quite so loud, is that we're in the very fortunate position that the government is actually doing a lot of is doing this for us. This is happening because the coalition government wished to do this. It now has support across the House. So it is a very different position. We are merely sort of cheerleaders saying we think this is good. We do think there are some things that could be maybe a bit different, but we broadly agree with it. And that is obviously very different to organisations which are specifically campaigning against something that the government have already said they wish to do.
It's also worth noting that actually in a straight race down between yes to traditional marriage or yes to same-sex marriage, we were never going to win in numbers terms. It would never have happened. The LGBT community, the infrastructure around the LGBT community is nowhere near as developed as the religious community. We have about 300 organisations in the UK, LGBT organisations in the UK, and most of those operate on less than £10,000 a year. There are a couple of large charities, Stonewall, who have been in here today. They're our biggest, but they don't bring in anywhere near the same amount of cash as even a handful of the Catholic charities, for instance. One of the things that has been heartening through this campaign, though, is the change of position of the Catholics on family values and actually LGBT parenting. We had the statement from the Catholics last week, I believe, week before last, where they stated that they actually saw that LGBT parents now were a positive thing, and that came after them closing down all their adoption centres because of having to support LGBT adoptees. And actually that shows that this sort of issue does progress, and it does progress in the religious community as well. So, give it time, and I'm sure that we'll have more of the mainstream religions opt in to...
We've had a lot. We've had bishops already, and we've had canons, and we've had deans, and we've had lots of Church of England vicars recording videos and helping us and supporting us. And I do actually think that tide is turning, certainly religiously.
Jim Shannon.
Your submission to us today, the terminology I believe was a statement of balancing rights. I'm just keen to get your opinion in relation to the quadruple lock that government says will make sure that religious organisations who don't agree with same-sex marriage do not have to, are not obliged to marry those of the same gender. Also, the same problem has occurred, you've probably heard today already from other members, in relation to teachers and registers as well. Again, the issue for many of those will be that they feel that their beliefs may suffer as a result of this change of legislation. I'm just keen to get your opinion. Do you support these protections for these people and for these organisations?
Can I, just before you answer, we have got some intelligence there's going to be a voted for, so if you could take 2 minutes to answer the question, please, it would be appreciated.
I think broadly we do support it. There is some concern over individual Church of England ministers who are not able to perform same-sex marriages that wish to do it, but I think we broadly support it. James?
Yeah, I mean, we need to definitely, it is our position that no religious minister should be forced to perform a same-sex marriage. And I don't think anyone would want to have someone celebrating their marriage who's being forced into doing it. It seems a very vile and benign way of celebrating a union. So I actually don't. I think it's all hot air and smoke, to be honest.
And the same opinion applies to teachers and registers as well. Is that right?
Teachers need to be professional in the way that they approach teaching. In my mind, they need to. I went to a very religious school. And I was told at the age of 17, I was pulled out of my classes, I was taken to the headmaster's office, and I was told I was a disappointment because I decided that actually in the yearbook I wrote the words, "So what if I am," as my headline on the top of my page. I got marched to that headmaster's office and they were going to expel me, and they were thinking about it, and this was back in 2000. I think that teachers need to be very wary that they take on a loco parentis role. They need to be careful about the ways in which they approach things, but they shouldn't be forced to say that I believe in gay marriage or same-sex marriage, if they don't. But they do need to be mindful that actually we support the rights of all individuals in this world.
Bear in mind that some of the children there may be the children of same-sex couples. So you don't want to have them questioning the validity of their own parents' relationships. With registrars, I mean, if they are civil registrars, this is civil marriage, so really they should be performing it.
So if a school or a local authority were to pressurise teachers or registrars to do something they didn't agree with, you would object to that?
Do you mean by registrars as in a civil registrar?
Yeah, civil registrar.
But that's slightly different, isn't it? Civil marriage is slightly different to religious marriage. Really big cases.
We're getting to the 4 o'clock. Is there any other questions from the committee members? If there's no other questions, can I thank you for giving your evidence today. And thanks for coming. For our next panel, because there's a vote due, we'll maybe probably on schedule at 4:15 to commence with the next panel. And we'll deal with that when we come back from the vote, which is about to be called at 4 o'clock. If there's any loss of time, you've got added time. Don't worry about losing the time in the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
The committee is suspended till 4:15.